Sometimes the path forward leads us exactly where we've been running from. Mylene Carter pressed her hand against her swollen belly as Brownie paced the edge of the Bitterroot National Forest, his chocolate coat gleaming with nervous sweat. For 3 days, her usually obedient retriever had refused his food, scratching at the back door and whining toward the tree line that bordered her rented cabin in Cedar Ridge, Montana. At 7 months pregnant and abandoned by the man who'd promised forever, Mylene had neither the energy nor the heart for her dog's mysterious anxieties. But when Brownie bolted into the dense pine forest that scorching July afternoon, she had no choice but to follow. The temperature soared past 90 degrees, yet something about the woods felt different, cooler, older, as if time moved differently beneath the canopy. Mylene's nursing background had taught her to trust instincts, and every instinct screamed that Brownie was leading her somewhere specific. Then she saw it, a log cabin that shouldn't exist, with smoke impossibly rising from its stone chimney in the summer heat. Through the window, a woman rocked a baby, and when their eyes met across the clearing, Mylene's blood turned to ice. The woman had her face, but 20 years older. What would you do if you met your own future in a place that shouldn't exist? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mylene's knees buckled, sending her stumbling backward against a towering ponderosa pine. The bark bit through her thin cotton dress, but the pain felt distant, muffled by the impossibility unfolding before her eyes. The woman in the cabin, herself but weathered by decades she hadn't lived, continued rocking, her movements hypnotically steady. The baby in her arms had the same delicate features Mylene had memorized from her ultrasound photographs, the ones now scattered across her kitchen table back in Cedar Ridge alongside Marcus's hastily scrawled goodbye note. Brownie sat perfectly still at the cabin's front steps, his tail wagging slowly as if he'd finally found what he'd been searching for. No longer the anxious, pacing creature who'd driven her to distraction for 3 sleepless nights. He belonged here, somehow, in this place that violated everything she knew about geography and physics. The heat that had been oppressive moments before gave way to an unnatural coolness that raised goosebumps along her arms. Mylene's breath came in short, sharp gasps, the kind that had sent patients into panic attacks during her years at Billings General. "Control your breathing," she told herself, drawing on training that felt like another lifetime. "Assess the situation. Find rational explanations." Except there weren't any. She'd studied these woods obsessively since moving to Cedar Ridge 3 months ago, desperate for solace after Marcus's betrayal. The Forest Service maps spread across her easel showed nothing but wilderness for 15 miles in every direction. No structures, no clearings, certainly no 19th century log cabin with hand-hewn beams and a foundation that looked older than Montana statehood. The older version of herself shifted in the rocking chair, and Mylene caught a glimpse of the baby's face. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Those were her eyes, the same unusual amber color inherited from her grandmother Emma, the woman who'd raised her after her parents died in the car crash when she was 12. The same eyes that had stared back at her from bathroom mirrors, through morning sickness and sleepless nights, wondering how she'd manage alone. Smoke continued curling from the chimney in lazy spirals that defied the 90-degree temperature. Inside the cabin, warm golden light flickered against the windows, oil lamps, not electricity. Everything about this place belonged to another century, another world entirely. Brownie whined softly, breaking the spell that held her frozen. He looked back at her with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. This was why he'd stopped eating, why he'd paced and scratched and led her here. Somehow, her dog had known about this impossible place hidden in the Montana wilderness. Mylene forced herself to take a step forward, then another. Her swollen ankles protested, and the baby kicked sharply against her rib cage as if sensing her distress. 7 months pregnant, abandoned, and now confronting what might be a complete psychological break or something far stranger. The rational part of her mind, the part trained to assess symptoms and diagnose conditions, whispered about stress-induced hallucinations and pregnancy psychosis. But the woman in the cabin looked up again, and their eyes met across 30 feet of impossible space. The recognition was mutual and immediate. Not just similar features or family resemblance, but the exact same face weathered by time and experience. The older Mylene smiled sadly, and Mylene felt that expression on her own lips, a mirror image separated by decades and circumstances that shouldn't exist. The baby in the woman's arms cooed softly, the sound carrying clearly through the summer air. Mylene's hand instinctively moved to her belly, feeling her own child respond with a flutter of movement. The connection between them felt electric, dangerous, like touching a live wire that might either illuminate everything or burn her world to ash. She thought of grandmother Emma's stories about the old country, about women in their family who'd always been different, blessed or cursed with sight beyond the ordinary. Stories Mylene had dismissed as folklore, the romantic notions of an old woman who'd lost too much too young. But Emma had died clutching Mylene's hand, whispering urgent words about circles and patterns, and bloodlines that couldn't be broken. Some paths can't be walked around, child. Only through. The memory hit like a physical blow. Emma's final words, spoken with fierce intensity while Montana snow piled against the hospital windows. Words that had made no sense then, but now felt like a warning Mylene should have heeded. The older woman in the cabin stood slowly, still holding the baby, and walked to the window. She pressed her palm against the glass, and Mylene found herself moving forward, drawn by a force stronger than fear or logic. Each step carried her deeper into impossibility, away from the world she knew and toward answers that might destroy everything she believed about reality. Brownie rose from his patient vigil and padded toward the cabin door, his tail wagging with the confidence of a dog who'd successfully completed his mission. Behind them, the Bitterroot wilderness waited in unnatural silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The sound that escaped Mylene's throat was half gasp, half sob, raw and desperate in the unnatural silence. She pressed both palms against the rough bark of the pine, anchoring herself to something real and solid, while her world tilted off its axis. The older woman's hand remained pressed against the glass, and for one impossible moment, Mylene felt the urge to match her palm to palm, separated only by the thin barrier of the window. Instead, she stumbled backward, crashing through underbrush that should have made noise but seemed muffled, distant. Her breath came in ragged pants that had nothing to do with the pregnancy and everything to do with the complete dissolution of everything she thought she knew about reality. "No," she whispered, then louder, "No, no, no." The words felt inadequate, childish, but they were all she had. She backed away until the cabin began to blur at the edges of her vision, until the golden light from the windows became just another trick of filtered sunlight through the canopy. Brownie barked once, sharp and commanding, the sound so normal it nearly made her laugh with hysteria. When she looked down, he was standing at her feet, his brown eyes reflecting the same patient intelligence that had gotten them through Marcus's abandonment, through the long nights when she'd painted until her fingers cramped and her back ached, trying to forget the engagement ring now sitting in a pawn shop in Billings. "Home," she told him, her voice cracking. "We're going home, now." The walk back through the forest felt like swimming upstream through thick honey. Every step required conscious effort, as if the wilderness itself was reluctant to let her go. Twice she looked back, but the trees had already swallowed the impossible cabin, leaving only the scent of wood smoke that shouldn't exist in 90-degree heat. By the time she stumbled out of the tree line behind her rented cottage, the sun had shifted enough to paint the kitchen windows gold. The sight of her ordinary life waiting exactly where she'd left it, easel by the window, half-finished landscape propped against the wall, breakfast dishes still in the sink, nearly broke her composure entirely. Brownie immediately went to his water bowl, lapping with the enthusiasm of a dog who'd completed an important mission. Mylene collapsed into the kitchen chair where she'd eaten cereal 3 hours ago, in a world where time moved forward and pregnant women didn't encounter their older selves in forests that weren't supposed to contain anything but trees and wildlife. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, muscle memory guiding her toward Marcus's number before rational thought intervened. What would she say? That she'd found a cabin that didn't exist? That she'd seen herself in 20 years, holding a baby that looked exactly like their ultrasound images. Marcus had already decided she was too much trouble, too complicated, especially after Emma's death had left Mylene raw and grieving, and apparently more strange than he could handle. "You live too much in your head, Mai," he'd said during one of their final fights, back when she still believed they could work through anything. Always seeing things that aren't there, making connections that don't make sense. It's exhausting. She'd thought he meant her art, the way she could see landscapes that didn't exist yet, paint light that wouldn't appear for hours. Now she wondered if he'd seen something deeper, something that ran in bloodlines and skipped generations until it manifested in young women who followed their dogs into impossible places. The baby kicked sharply, reminding her of immediate needs that had nothing to do with supernatural encounters. Food, rest, prenatal vitamins she'd forgotten to take in her morning haste to follow Brownie's increasingly frantic behavior. The mundane requirements of keeping herself and her unborn child healthy felt like anchors in a storm. She opened the refrigerator and stared at the sparse contents: eggs, milk going sour, leftover pasta that Marcus would have criticized for being too plain, too simple for his sophisticated palate. Everything he'd found lacking about her life in Cedar Ridge, the small-town grocery store with limited organic options, the lack of decent restaurants, the isolation he'd initially claimed to love but ultimately couldn't tolerate. The cottage itself was another reminder of choices that had led her here. She'd rented it sight unseen, drawn by online photos that captured the way afternoon light fell through the kitchen window, the view of the Bitterroot Mountains from the bedroom where she'd spent so many sleepless nights lately. It was supposed to be their fresh start, away from the chaos of Billings and the memories of Emma's long decline. Instead, it had become the place where Marcus finally admitted he wasn't ready for fatherhood, for the messy complications of loving someone who came with history and ghosts and expectations he couldn't meet. Now it was just hers, along with 7 months of pregnancy, dwindling savings, and a retriever who apparently could navigate between worlds that shouldn't exist. Brownie patted over and rested his head against her leg, his tail wagging slowly. For the first time in days, he seemed completely at peace. "Good boy," Mylene murmured, scratching behind Brownie's ears with fingers that still trembled. His contentment should have been comforting, but instead it felt like confirmation that what she'd witnessed was real. Dogs didn't lead their owners on elaborate stress-induced hallucinations. The phone rang, cutting through the afternoon quiet like a blade. Mylene stared at the unfamiliar number on the screen, her heart hammering. Nobody called her anymore except doctors' offices and the occasional wrong number. Marcus had taken their shared social circle with him when he left, and her art hadn't sold well enough to warrant gallery calls. "Hello? Miss Carter?" The voice was elderly, female, with a slight accent she couldn't place. "My name is Isabel Thorne. I believe we need to talk." Mylene's free hand instinctively moved to her belly. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" "Not yet, but I knew your grandmother Emma very well. I was wondering if you might have time for a visit this afternoon. I live just outside town, on the old mining road." The mention of Emma sent ice water through her veins. "My grandmother died 6 months ago." "Yes, child, I know. I should have called sooner, but, well, these things have their own timing. I suspect you're beginning to understand that now." The words hit like a physical blow. Mylene gripped the phone tighter, her other hand still buried in Brownie's fur. "What do you mean by that?" A long pause. In the background, Mylene could hear what sounded like wind chimes, though the afternoon air outside her cottage was perfectly still. "Your dog's been restless lately, hasn't he? Leading you places you didn't expect to go?" Mylene's breath caught. She looked down at Brownie, who had lifted his head and was staring at the phone with the same intense focus he'd shown at the forest's edge. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because Emma asked me to watch for the signs. She was very specific about what would happen when your time came." Isabel's voice carried a weight of certainty that made Mylene's skin prickle. The restlessness always starts with the animals. They can sense the thinning between worlds better than we can. Thinning between... Mylene stopped herself. This was insane. She was 7 months pregnant, abandoned, and apparently losing her grip on reality so thoroughly that strangers were calling to discuss her delusions. "Miss Carter, are you still there?" "Yes, but I think there's been some mistake. I don't know what my grandmother might have told you, but she told me you'd found the cabin today." The phone slipped from Myleen's nerveless fingers, clattering against the kitchen table. For a moment, she could only stare at it while Isabel's voice continued. "Tinny and distant, Miss Carter? Please don't hang up. I know this is frightening, but you're not going crazy. What you saw was real." With shaking hands, Myleen retrieved the phone. "That's impossible. There's no cabin out there. I've studied every map of these woods. Maps don't show everything, child. Especially not the places that exist between what was and what will be." Isabel's voice gentled. "Your grandmother experienced the same thing when she was pregnant with your mother. And her grandmother before that. It runs in the bloodline but only manifests during pregnancy, when the veil is thinnest." Myleen felt the baby kick, as if responding to the conversation. "You're telling me this is hereditary?" In a manner of speaking. Emma was supposed to explain everything when your time came, but cancer took her before she could prepare you properly. She made me promise to help when the signs appeared. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the afternoon light too bright. Myleen closed her eyes, trying to process information that violated everything she understood about the world. "Help with what exactly?" "Understanding what you're seeing, and more importantly, understanding what it means for your child." The words hit like a cold wind. Myleen's eyes snapped open. "What does any of this have to do with my baby?" "Everything," Isabel said simply. "The woman you saw in the cabin, she's showing you a choice. Every generation of women in your family faces the same decision when they're pregnant. Emma chose one path. Your mother would have chosen another, if she'd lived long enough to understand what was happening." Myleen thought of her parents' car accident, the way it had happened so suddenly when her mother was 8 months pregnant with what would have been Myleen's younger sibling. She'd always wondered if the stress of the pregnancy had somehow contributed to her father's momentary inattention on that rain-slicked road. What kind of choice? The kind that determines not just your future, but the future of every generation that comes after you. The kind that can't be made without understanding what you're truly choosing between. Isabel paused. "Will you come see me, Miss Carter? There are things Emma left for you, things you'll need to see before you have to decide." Brownie whined softly and moved to the door, his tail wagging with the same purposeful energy he'd shown that morning. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the Bitterroot Mountains despite the afternoon heat, and the first rumble of thunder rolled across the valley like a warning. Myleen stared at the phone long after the line went dead, Isabel's words echoing in the sudden silence. "Things you'll need to see before you have to decide." The phrase lodged in her chest like a splinter, sharp and impossible to ignore. She set the phone down with deliberate care, as if sudden movements might shatter what remained of her composure. Outside, the storm clouds continued their slow advance across the valley, transforming the afternoon light from gold to pewter. The first fat raindrops hit the kitchen window, each one making her flinch. "This is insane," she whispered to the empty room. But even as she said it, her hand moved to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movements. Had her child somehow sensed the strangeness of the day? The impossibility of what lay waiting in the forest? Brownie whined again and scratched at the door, his earlier contentment replaced by renewed urgency. The sound grated against her nerves like fingernails on glass. She'd followed him once today into a world that shouldn't exist, and look where it had led her. Now a stranger was calling with intimate knowledge of her family's secrets, speaking of choices and bloodlines and things Emma had never mentioned in all their years together. Or had she? Myleen closed her eyes and tried to remember her grandmother's final days in the hospital. The morphine had made Emma's words slurred, often nonsensical. She'd talked about circles and patterns, about women in their family who carried burdens across generations. At the time, Myleen had assumed it was the medication talking, the confused ramblings of a dying woman trying to make sense of a life that had held too much loss. Some paths can't be walked around, child. Only through... The memory hit with fresh force, bringing with it the antiseptic smell of the hospital room and the weight of Emma's hand clutching hers. Her grandmother's eyes had been clear in that moment, lucid and desperate, as if she was trying to compress decades of wisdom into her final breaths. But Mylene had been grieving, exhausted from months of watching cancer slowly steal the only family she had left. She dismissed the urgent words as delirium, focusing instead on the mundane tasks of funeral arrangements and estate settling. She'd packed Emma's belongings without really looking at them, storing boxes in her Billings apartment that she'd never found the courage to open. Those boxes were here now, stacked in the cottage's spare bedroom like accusers. She'd told herself she was waiting for the right time to go through them, when the grief wasn't so raw. But maybe she'd been avoiding something deeper. Maybe some part of her had sensed that Emma's possessions held answers to questions she wasn't ready to ask. The baby kicked sharply, making her gasp. The movement felt different somehow, more purposeful than the usual restless shifts she'd grown accustomed to, as if her child was responding to the conversation, to the weight of decisions that apparently stretched back through generations of women she'd never known. Thunder rolled closer now, and the rain began in earnest. Mylene watched water stream down the window and thought about Isabel Thorne, a woman she'd never met, who somehow knew about her mourning in the forest. The old mining road Isabel had mentioned was barely passable, a rutted track that wound into the foothills where the original copper claims had played out decades ago. It would take 20 minutes to drive there in good weather. But what would she find? More impossibilities? More strangers who claimed intimate knowledge of her family's hidden history? The rational part of her mind insisted this was exactly how delusions spiraled out of control. First you saw things that weren't there. Then you started believing other people could see them too. Next would come the complete break from reality that left pregnant women wandering in hospital gowns, talking to people who existed only in their fractured minds. She thought of Marcus's face during their final fight, the mixture of frustration and something that might have been fear. You live too much in your head, Mai. Always seeing things that aren't there. Maybe he'd been right. Maybe the stress of pregnancy and abandonment and grief had finally pushed her past the edge of sanity. But Brownie was staring at her with those intelligent brown eyes, and she couldn't shake the memory of how purposefully he'd led her to the cabin. Dogs didn't participate in elaborate hallucinations. They lived in the immediate world of scent and sound and instinct, and every fiber of his being insisted that what they'd encountered was real. The storm was strengthening, lightning illuminating the kitchen in stark flashes. Soon the old mining road would be impassable, washed out by mountain runoff that turned dirt tracks into treacherous streams. If she was going to see Isabel Thorne today, she'd have to decide now. Mylene's hand found her car keys on the kitchen counter, and she stared at them as if they might provide answers. Outside, Brownie's whining grew more insistent, and the baby's movements felt like urgent messages in a language she didn't understand. The weight of choice pressed down on her, heavy as the storm clouds gathering overhead. The keys felt cold against her palm, their familiar weight somehow foreign now. Mylene closed her fingers around them and felt the last threads of her ordinary life begin to fray. Everything rational screamed at her to stay inside, to wait out the storm, to call a doctor and discuss the stress-induced hallucinations that were clearly symptoms of a breakdown she could still pull back from. But the baby kicked again, insistent as a drumbeat, and Brownie's whining rose to match the wind rattling the windows. The sound went straight through her, urgent and wild, as if he understood something she was still fighting to accept. Some paths can't be walked around, child. Only through... Emma's words rose from memory like smoke, and suddenly Mylene could see her grandmother's face in those final hospital moments, not confused or medicated, but desperately clear. Emma had been trying to tell her something important, something that couldn't wait for a better time or gentler circumstances, and Mylene had been too wrapped in grief to listen. She stood abruptly, the kitchen chair scraping against linoleum that Marcus had criticized for being outdated. Everything in this cottage bore the weight of his disappointment now, the cramped rooms, the view he'd called pretty but impractical, the isolation that had driven him back to Billings, and whatever uncomplicated life he was building without her. But maybe that disappointment had never really been about the cottage. Maybe it had been about her, about the strangeness Isabel claimed ran in her bloodline, the way she saw things that shouldn't exist and made connections other people couldn't follow. Marcus had sensed something wrong with her, long before she'd understood it herself. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Through the kitchen window, she could see the forest edge where this morning's impossibility waited. The trees swayed in the wind, their branches reaching toward the cottage like beckoning arms, and she felt the pull of whatever lay deeper in those woods. It wasn't finished with her yet. Whatever she'd encountered in that cabin was only the beginning. "All right," she whispered, and Brownie's ears perked forward. "All right, we'll go." The words felt like stepping off a cliff. Her hands moved without conscious thought, grabbing her jacket from the back of the door, her purse from the counter, the prenatal vitamins she probably should have taken hours ago. Brownie danced with excitement, his tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled. He knew. Somehow, he understood that she'd finally stopped fighting what needed to happen. The drive would take her through town first, past the general store where she bought groceries and the diner where she sometimes ate breakfast when the cottage felt too quiet. Normal places where normal people lived normal lives, unmarked by visions of impossible cabins and phone calls from strangers who spoke of bloodlines and choices. She was leaving all of that behind now, crossing into territory where maps didn't show everything, and pregnant women faced decisions that would echo through generations. The rain soaked through her jacket in the few seconds it took to reach the car, and Brownie bounded into the passenger seat with obvious relief. His brown eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, bright with satisfaction, as if he'd been waiting all day for her to come to her senses. "I hope you know what we're doing," she told him, turning the key in the ignition. The engine caught on the second try, reliable despite its age. She'd bought this car used, choosing practicality over Marcus's suggestions for something newer, more impressive. Now she was grateful for its sturdy simplicity, its ability to handle mountain roads that challenged flashier vehicles. The windshield wipers fought against the storm as she pulled out of the gravel driveway, their rhythm matching her heartbeat. Behind them, the cottage grew smaller in the mirror, its windows glowing warm and safe in the gray afternoon light. She was leaving her sanctuary, the place where she'd tried to build a life that made sense, where she'd painted landscapes that existed only in her imagination, and told herself that was strange enough for any one person. But imagination, apparently, had nothing to do with what she'd seen in the forest. The baby shifted inside her as they reached the main road, and Mylene pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the solid reality of her child's presence. Everything else might be impossible, but this was real, this life growing inside her, this responsibility that would soon reshape everything she thought she knew about herself. Isabel Thorne had spoken of choices that determined futures, of decisions that couldn't be made without understanding. Whatever waited at the end of the old mining road, whatever truths Emma had hidden in boxes Mylene had been too afraid to open, she was ready now. The storm closed behind them like a door, and ahead lay only the unknown. The rain turned the main road treacherous, forcing Mylene to grip the steering wheel tighter as they descended into Cedar Ridge proper. Through the blur of windshield wipers, the town looked different than it had this morning, smaller somehow, as if the storm had compressed it into something fragile and temporary. The few people she glimpsed moved quickly between buildings, hunched against the downpour like survivors of some unnamed catastrophe. At the general store, old Pete Morrison stood in the doorway watching her pass, his weathered face creased with something that might have been concern. He raised one hand in a slow wave, and Mylene found herself wondering if he knew where she was heading, if he too was part of whatever web of secrets Emma had left behind. The thought made her hands shake. How many people in this small town knew about her family's history? How many had been watching her these past months, waiting for signs that the strangeness was manifesting? She felt suddenly exposed, as if her pregnancy had marked her as clearly as a target. Brownie whined softly from the passenger seat, pressing his nose against the window. His breath fogged the glass, and for a moment Mylene could swear she saw shapes in the condensation, faces perhaps, or symbols that meant something to whatever ancient part of her brain was slowly awakening to impossibilities. The turnoff to the old mining road appeared sooner than expected, half hidden by overgrown blackberry bushes that scraped against the car's sides as they turned. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to rutted dirt that turned the vehicle into a bucking animal. Each pothole sent jolts through her belly, making the baby kick in protest. "Sorry, little one," she murmured, one hand on her stomach while the other fought to keep them on what passed for a road. "We're almost there." But were they? The mining road stretched ahead through dense forest that seemed to swallow their headlights. Ancient pine and fir pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that the storm's fury became a distant whisper. This was old growth, the kind of forest that had stood when the first copper miners arrived, when her great-grandmother had been young and facing her own impossible choices. The trees felt aware somehow, watching. Mylene caught glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, flickers of white that might have been deer, or might have been something else entirely. Brownie's ears pricked forward, alert but not alarmed, as if he recognized whatever presence moved through the forest beside them. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they crested a small hill, and Isabel Thorne's house came into view. It was nothing like what Mylene had expected. Instead of the weathered cabin her imagination had constructed, a tidy Victorian cottage sat in a clearing that looked deliberately carved from the wilderness. Warm light spilled from tall windows, and smoke rose from a stone chimney, despite the summer heat. But it was the garden that made her breath catch. Even in the storm, she could see it was impossible. Flowers blooming in riot of color that belonged to different seasons, different climates entirely. Roses twined with jasmine, while beneath them grew herbs she recognized from her grandmother's sketches, mugwort and vervain, wormwood and plants whose names Emma had whispered like prayers. "Jesus," Mylene whispered, parking beside a battered pickup truck that looked old enough to have belonged to the original miners. "What is this place?" Before she could lose her nerve, the cottage door opened and a woman stepped onto the covered porch. Isabel Thorne was perhaps 60, with iron-gray hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to hold too much knowledge. She wore a simple blue dress that should have looked ordinary but somehow didn't, as if it were cut from fabric that followed different rules. "Miss Carter," Isabel called, her voice carrying easily through the storm. "Come inside before you catch your death. And bring your dog, he'll want to see this too." The certainty in her tone brooked no argument. Mylene found herself climbing out of the car, Brownie bounding ahead toward the porch with his tail wagging. The rain soaked through her jacket instantly, but the garden's impossible scents cut through the storm. Summer roses and winter pine, spring lavender and autumn sage, all blooming together in defiance of season and sense. Isabel met them at the porch steps, and up close her eyes were even more unsettling. They seemed to shift color in the lamplight, from brown to green to something that might have been gold. When she smiled, Mylene felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. "Your grandmother spoke of you often," Isabel said, ushering them toward the door. "She was so proud of your art, the way you could see beauty in places others overlooked. She said you had the gift even as a child." "What gift?" Mylene's voice came out smaller than intended. Isabel paused with her hand on the door handle, studying Mylene's face with those unsettling eyes. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of prophecy. "The gift that's about to change everything, child. The same gift that's been blessing and cursing the women of your bloodline for 5 generations. Step inside, and I'll show you exactly what your grandmother never found the courage to explain." The door opened onto warmth that felt almost liquid after the storm's bite. Mylene stepped across the threshold, water dripping from her jacket onto floors of polished wood that gleamed like honey in the lamplight. The cottage's interior defied its modest exterior. Rooms seemed to flow into each other without logical boundaries, and the ceiling stretched higher than the roofline should have allowed. "Sit," Isabel commanded, gesturing toward a worn leather chair positioned near a fireplace where flames danced despite the summer heat outside. "You look ready to collapse, and we can't have that. Not with what's coming. Mylene sank into the chair before her legs could give out entirely. The baby had gone still inside her, as if sensing they'd entered a place where normal rules didn't apply. Brownie padded across the room to settle at her feet, his usual restlessness replaced by watchful calm. Isabel moved through the cottage with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. She returned carrying a tray laden with a steaming mug and what looked like fresh-baked bread, impossible in its warmth. The scent that rose from the mug was complex. Herbs Mylene couldn't name, honey, and something darker underneath. "Drink," Isabel said, settling into the chair across from her. "It'll help with the nausea you've been fighting all week." Mylene hadn't mentioned feeling sick to anyone, but when she lifted the mug, her stomach settled for the first time in days. The liquid was amber-colored and tasted of earth and growing things, with an aftertaste that lingered like memory. "You said you knew my grandmother." The words came out steadier than she felt. "Emma was my dearest friend for 40 years. Isabel's voice carried genuine grief. "We met when we were both young women facing choices we didn't understand. She chose one path, I chose another, but we stayed connected through all of it." The cottage felt larger in the firelight, shadows stretching toward corners that shouldn't exist. Mylene caught glimpses of things that didn't quite make sense. Books whose titles shifted when she wasn't looking directly at them, paintings that seemed to move in her peripheral vision. On the mantelpiece sat photographs of women she didn't recognize, though something about their faces felt familiar. "What did you mean about a gift?" Mylene's hands tightened around the warm mug. "And bloodlines? My grandmother never mentioned any family history beyond her parents." Isabel leaned forward, her strange eyes reflecting the firelight like a cat's. "Emma was protecting you. She thought if she never spoke of it, maybe the inheritance would skip you entirely. Maybe you could live a normal life, marry your young man, raise your children without ever knowing what runs in your veins." Marcus left. The admission slipped out before Mylene could stop it. "He said I was too strange, too unpredictable. Maybe he was right." "Oh, child." Isabel's expression softened with something that might have been pity. "He left because he sensed what you are, even if he couldn't name it. Men like him always do. They're drawn to the power, but they can't handle what comes with it." Outside, the storm intensified, wind rattling the windows with increasing fury. But inside the cottage, the fire burned steady, and the air felt thick with possibility. Mylene thought of the cabin in the forest, of the older woman who had worn her face, and felt something shift in her chest, fear transforming into something harder. "What exactly am I supposed to be?" she asked. Isabel rose and walked to an antique desk in the corner, returning with a leather-bound journal that looked centuries old. She placed it in Mylene's lap with reverent care. "Your great-great-grandmother started this record," Isabel said. "Every generation has added to it. Emma was supposed to give it to you when you turned 18, but she couldn't bear to burden you with the knowledge. She thought love might be stronger than blood." Mylene opened the journal with trembling fingers. The first page was covered in spidery handwriting she didn't recognize, but the name at the top made her breath catch. Margaret Carter, 1923. Her great-great-grandmother, the woman Emma had mentioned only in passing. "The sight came to me on my 18th birthday," the entry began. "Mother said it would, but I didn't believe her until I saw my own death in the mirror's reflection." "Sight?" Mylene's voice cracked. "The ability to see across time," Isabel said quietly. "Past, future, sometimes both at once. It manifests differently in each generation, but it always comes. Usually triggered by major life changes, marriage, pregnancy, loss." The baby kicked suddenly, violently, as if responding to the words. Mylene gasped, one hand flying to her belly, and for a moment she could swear she heard something, not quite a voice but a presence brushing against the edges of her consciousness. "The child knows," Isabel observed. "They always do. Your daughter will be stronger than any who came before her." "Daughter?" Mylene whispered. Isabel smiled, but there was sorrow in it. "Oh yes, child, you're carrying the next keeper of the gift, and unlike you, she'll be born knowing exactly what she is." The journal slipped from Myleen's hands, hitting the floor with a sound like thunder. Pages scattered across the wooden boards, revealing fragments of her family's hidden history, sketches of symbols that hurt to look at directly, pressed flowers that should have crumbled to dust decades ago, and handwriting that seemed to writhe in the firelight. No. The word tore from her throat as she lurched forward in the chair. No, I won't let this happen to her. Whatever this is, whatever curse runs in our blood, it stops with me. Isabel's expression hardened. You think you can choose? Child, your grandmother tried to break the cycle. She moved away from the family, married a man who knew nothing of our ways, raised your mother to believe in nothing but what could be seen and measured. And what happened? Myleen's mother had died when she was 7, an aneurysm that came without warning, sudden and brutal. She'd collapsed in their kitchen while making breakfast, and Myleen had found her lying on the linoleum, eyes open but seeing nothing. The memory hit her like a physical blow. She tried to deny what she was. Isabel continued relentlessly. The gift demands acknowledgement. When we fight it, it turns destructive. Your mother's death wasn't random, Myleen. It was the bloodline reclaiming what had been denied. You're lying. But even as she spoke, Myleen remembered her mother's headaches, the way she'd press her palms against her temples and whisper about seeing things that weren't there. The strange drawings hidden in her bedroom closet, symbols that matched the ones now scattered across Isabel's floor. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and suddenly Myleen was somewhere else entirely. She stood in a delivery room flooded with harsh fluorescent light, her own voice screaming as contractions tore through her body. But the woman on the bed wasn't quite her. This version was older, harder, her face marked by years of accepting impossible truths. Push, a doctor commanded, and the other Myleen bore down with desperate strength. When the baby finally emerged, she was perfect. Tiny fingers and rosebud mouth, dark hair damp with birth. But her eyes, when they opened, held ancient knowledge. She looked at her mother with recognition that no newborn should possess. She's beautiful, the doctor said, but his voice carried unease. Those eyes. Have you ever seen eyes like that on a baby? The vision shattered like glass, leaving Myleen gasping in Isabel's chair. Her hands flew to her belly, feeling the solid reality of her unborn daughter. But now she could sense something else, a presence, a consciousness that pulsed with each heartbeat. Mother, came a voice that wasn't quite a voice, more like thought transmitted directly into her mind. Don't fight what we are, Myleen screamed. The sound echoed through the cottage, seeming to shake the very foundations. Books fell from shelves, and the fire in the hearth flared so high it nearly reached the ceiling. Brownie whimpered and pressed himself against her legs, offering what comfort he could. She's trying to prepare you, Isabel said, her voice steady despite the chaos. The child knows what's coming. Every keeper of the gift faces a choice when their daughter is born. Accept the responsibility and teach her to control what she is, or deny it and watch the power consume everything she touches. I won't let her become like that woman in the cabin. Myleen's voice was raw from screaming. I won't let her live knowing she'll never escape this curse. The woman in the cabin is your future, Isabel said quietly. One of them, anyway. The timeline where you accept what you are, where you guide your daughter instead of abandoning her to figure it out alone. There are darker paths, child. Much darker. As if summoned by her words, the air in the cottage grew thick and oppressive. The shadows in the corners began to move with purpose, and Myleen caught glimpses of other scenes, her daughter as a teenager, eyes blazing with uncontrolled power as she stood over Marcus's broken body. Her daughter as a woman, alone in a psychiatric hospital, restrained and medicated while visions of past and future drove her to madness. Stop, Myleen whispered. But the images kept coming. Her daughter running through dark forests, pursued by something that wore human faces but moved like predators. Her daughter giving birth to another gifted child. The cycle beginning again without anyone to teach them control or purpose. These are the futures where you try to run, Isabel said, where you keep believing you can choose a normal life. The gift doesn't disappear when we deny it, Myleen. It just grows wild and dangerous. The baby moved again, and this time Mylene felt it, a brush of consciousness against her own, alien but unmistakably loving. Her daughter wasn't a curse or a burden. She was a person, complex and powerful and deserving of guidance rather than abandonment. What do I have to do? The words came out broken, defeated. Isabel's smile held both triumph and sorrow. First, you have to survive what's coming. The gift always demands a price for awakening, and yours is about to be collected. The cottage door exploded inward with a sound like breaking bones. Wind howled through the opening, but this wasn't the storm they'd driven through. This was something else entirely. Air that tasted of copper and desperation, carrying voices that spoke in languages predating human speech. The fire in the hearth guttered and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by the sickly green light that pulsed from the forest beyond. "No," Isabel whispered. And for the first time since Mylene had met her, the older woman's voice carried genuine fear. "It's too early. She's not ready." Brownie pressed against Mylene's legs, his body trembling with tension. But he wasn't cowering. He was protecting, hackles raised against something that emerged from the swirling darkness outside. Shapes moved in the green light, tall and wrong, with limbs that bent at angles that hurt to perceive. "What is that?" Mylene tried to stand, but her body felt heavy as lead. The baby inside her had gone completely still, as if hiding from whatever approached. "The collectors," Isabel said, backing toward the far wall. "They come when a new keeper awakens. They feed on the transition, on the moment when power shifts from one generation to the next. I thought we had more time, months before your daughter was born, before the inheritance fully manifested." The first figure stepped across the threshold, and Mylene's mind recoiled from trying to process what she saw. It wore the rough approximation of human form, but its features kept shifting like smoke. When it turned toward her, she glimpsed Marcus's face for a moment, then her mother's, then strangers whose eyes held nothing but hunger. "They're drawn by strong emotions," Isabel whispered urgently. "Fear, desperation, the kind of deep terror that opens cracks between worlds. Your awakening called them here." More figures crowded through the doorway, their forms rippling and changing with each step. The cottage felt smaller now, walls pressing inward as if reality itself was collapsing. The scattered journal pages began to smoke and curl, the carefully preserved family history dissolving into ash. "Mother," came her daughter's voice again, but weaker now, distant. "I can't. It's too much." "They're draining her," Mylene gasped, feeling the connection to her unborn child fade like a radio signal losing strength. "They're taking her power before she's even born." One of the collectors turned its shifting face toward her belly, and she saw hunger in its borrowed features, an appetite that could never be satisfied. It reached out with fingers that weren't quite fingers, and where they passed, the air itself seemed to decay. Isabel threw herself between them, pulling something from her dress pocket, a small cloth bag that pulsed with its own inner light. "Stay back," she commanded, but her voice was already growing weaker. "This child is under my protection." The collector that wore Marcus's face laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your protection means nothing here, old woman. The bloodline ends tonight. The gift dies with both of them." "No," Mylene whispered, but she could feel it happening. The presence she'd sensed in her daughter was fading, the bright consciousness that had touched her mind growing dim. All around her, the cottage dissolved into shadow and hunger. Isabel's protective charm flared once, then crumbled to ash in her hands. The old woman collapsed to her knees, her iron-gray hair suddenly white, her face aging decades in moments. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I should have prepared you sooner. Should have told Emma the truth before it was too late." The collectors closed in, and Mylene felt her daughter's mind slip away entirely. The baby still moved in her womb, but whatever made her more than human was gone, consumed by things that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence between thoughts. "It's over," Mylene realized with crystalline clarity. "I've lost her before she was even born." The collectors began to fade, their hunger temporarily sated. They'd taken what they came for, not just her daughter's gift, but the entire bloodline's accumulated power. 5 generations of careful preservation, of secrets passed from mother to daughter, gone in moments. As the cottage returned to normal, the fire rekindling itself in the hearth, Mylene pressed both hands to her belly. Her daughter kicked weakly, just a normal baby now. Normal and powerless and safe from the burden that had destroyed every woman in their family. She should have felt relieved. She'd wanted this. Wanted her daughter to live free from curses and visions and the weight of inherited madness. But all she felt was empty, hollowed out like a tree struck by lightning. "The journals," she whispered, looking at the ash scattered across the floor. "All of it's gone." Isabel struggled to her feet, her movements those of a much older woman now. The collectors take everything when they feed. History, power, even memory fades in time. Your daughter will grow up normal, as you wanted. But she'll also grow up unprotected. Outside, the storm was breaking apart, normal wind replacing the supernatural fury. But Mylene could still feel them watching from the forest, patient hunters who knew that gifts sometimes skip generations, that power might yet resurface in unexpected ways. She'd won. And in winning, she'd lost everything that might have protected them both. The silence felt heavier than the chaos that had preceded it. Mylene sat in Isabel's chair, staring at the ash that had once been 5 generations of carefully preserved knowledge, and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not breaking, boot-opening, like a door she'd kept locked her entire life. "No," she said quietly, and Isabel looked up from where she knelt, gathering the remnants of her protective charm. "Child, it's over. The collectors—" "No." Mylene stood, her hands still pressed to her belly where her daughter moved with ordinary human life. "They didn't take everything. They couldn't have." The cottage around them felt different now. Smaller, more mundane. The books on the shelves were just books, their titles fixed and readable. The paintings showed static scenes of pastoral life. Even the photographs on the mantelpiece had changed, showing only Isabel at various ages, alone. But Mylene could still taste the herbal tea on her tongue, still feel the echo of her daughter's consciousness brushing against her mind. The collectors had fed on the accumulated power of generations, yes, but they hadn't erased what had already awakened within her. "The woman in the cabin," she said, pacing to the window where normal storm clouds were breaking apart to reveal stars. "I saw myself, 20 years older, but that wasn't a vision of the future, was it?" Isabel's weathered hands stilled among the ashes. "What do you mean?" "You said the gift lets us see across time, past and future." Mylene turned from the window, and for the first time since entering this cottage, she felt completely clear-headed. "But what if it's more than seeing? What if we can reach across time?" The old woman's eyes widened with something between hope and terror. "Mylene, no. That kind of connection is dangerous? Impossible?" Mylene laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everything tonight has been impossible. I'm 7 months pregnant, abandoned by the man I thought loved me, sitting in a cottage that shouldn't exist while discussing how my unborn daughter's supernatural inheritance was just devoured by things that feed on power itself. I think we're past worrying about what's possible." She pressed both hands to her belly and reached inward, searching for the connection she'd felt so briefly. Her daughter's presence was muted now, dampened but not gone, and beneath that, she sensed something else, older, deeper. Not the accumulated power of her bloodline, but the fundamental truth that had drawn that power to them in the first place. "They took the gift," she said slowly, understanding blooming like pain in her chest. "But they didn't take what made us worthy of it." The air in the cottage began to thicken again, but this felt different from the collector's hungry darkness. This was potential, pure and clean as mountain air. Brownie whined and moved closer to her legs, but his tail wagged tentatively. "Love," Mylene whispered, the revelation hitting her like lightning. That's what Marcus couldn't handle. Not just the strangeness, but the depth. We feel everything more intensely. Loss, joy, connection. The visions weren't the source of our power. They were just how it manifested. Isabel struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on the chair. "Child, what are you thinking?" I'm thinking that woman in the cabin wasn't showing me my future. She was showing me my choice. Mylene closed her eyes and reached deeper, past her daughter's quiet presence, past her own fears, towards something that pulsed with the rhythm of her heartbeat. Every keeper of the gift faces the same decision: protect the next generation or let them face it alone. But protection doesn't have to mean burden. The connection snapped into place like a puzzle piece finding its home. Suddenly, Mylene could sense them, all of them. Her mother, dead for 21 years but somehow still present in the spaces between moments. Her grandmother Emma, her great-great-grandmother Margaret, and others stretching back through generations of women who had carried impossible knowledge and impossible love. They hadn't been destroyed by the collectors. They had been freed from the accumulated weight of centuries, refined down to their essential truth. They were protectors, guardians who chose love over safety, connection over isolation. The collectors fed on our power, Mylene said, opening her eyes to find Isabel staring at her with something approaching awe. But they couldn't digest what made us who we are. Love doesn't transfer. It has to be chosen, again and again. Her daughter moved in her womb, a flutter that felt like recognition, not the alien consciousness that had spoken to her mind, but something simpler and infinitely more precious: trust. Her child trusted her to make the right choice, even without supernatural insight to guide them. She'll be born normal, Mylene said, and for the first time the words didn't feel like loss, no visions, no inherited burden, but she'll also be born loved and protected and prepared for whatever comes, because some things are stronger than curses or gifts or family history. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The storm had passed completely, leaving the world washed clean and full of possibility. The revelation settled into her bones like truth finding its rightful place. She didn't need supernatural power to protect her daughter. She just needed to choose love, every day, for the rest of their lives. The morning light streaming through Isabel's windows felt like absolution. Mylene stood at the threshold between night and day, one hand resting on her belly where her daughter stirred with ordinary, precious life, and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: purpose. "I can't go back to Cedar Ridge," she said, turning from the window to find Isabel watching her with quiet intensity. "Not to that empty rental house, waiting for Marcus to change his mind or for my savings to run out." The old woman nodded slowly. "The town holds nothing for you now but ghosts and small-minded whispers. But where will you go? You're 7 months pregnant, child. The world isn't kind to women in your condition without support." Mylene walked to where the journals had been scattered, kneeling to touch the ash that remained. Her fingers came away clean. Whatever the collectors had taken was gone completely, as if it had never existed. But the absence didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like clearing away old debris to make room for something new. "My grandmother's house in Oregon," she said suddenly, the memory surfacing like a gift. "Emma left it to my mother, who never sold it. It's been sitting empty for decades, but the property taxes are paid through some trust fund she set up." She looked up at Isabel with growing excitement. "I could restore it, make it a place where my daughter can grow up with stories instead of burdens." Isabel's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile Mylene had seen from her. Stories have their own kind of power, safer than gifts, but just as important for passing truth between generations. Brownie padded over to investigate the ashes, sniffing carefully before settling beside Mylene with a contented sigh. His strange behavior of the past weeks had vanished completely. Whatever had been calling him into the forest was gone now, leaving behind just a loyal dog ready to follow his family wherever they needed to go. "I'll need help," Mylene admitted, settling cross-legged on the floor despite her bulk. "The house will need work, and I'll be a new mother with no experience. But maybe," she paused, struck by sudden certainty, "maybe that's where you come in." Isabel raised an eyebrow. "I'm an old woman who just lost everything she spent her life protecting. What help could I offer?" "You know the real stories," Mylene said. "Not the supernatural inheritance part. I think we're both done with that particular burden. But the human stories. What it was like for these women to make impossible choices, to protect their daughters while living with secrets that isolated them from everyone else. Those stories matter. The cottage around them felt different in the morning light. Smaller, simpler, but somehow more real. The books on Isabel's shelves were just books now, but that didn't diminish their value. If anything, it made them more precious. Knowledge earned through living rather than inherited through blood. "I could tell those stories," Isabel said thoughtfully. "Help you understand what your mother and grandmother faced, why they made the choices they did. Not as mystical legacy, but as human truth." Mylene felt her daughter kick, a strong, healthy movement that spoke of normal development and ordinary miracles. She'll grow up knowing she comes from a line of strong women who chose love over fear. That's inheritance enough. The collectors might return, Isabel warned. Power sometimes skips generations or manifests in unexpected ways. Your daughter might be safe, but her children? Then we'll be ready with better tools than supernatural gifts, Mylene said firmly. Community, support, the kind of preparation that doesn't isolate children from the world but teaches them how to navigate it. She struggled to her feet, her hands braced against her lower back. "I spent my whole life afraid I was going crazy like my mother." But maybe she wasn't crazy. Maybe she was just alone with something too big to carry by herself. Isabel moved to her small kitchen, beginning the familiar ritual of making tea. "In Oregon, you'll need practical things. Prenatal care, somewhere to give birth, supplies for the baby, and repairs for the house." "I have some savings left," Mylene said, "and I can sell my art once I'm settled. People always want paintings of peaceful country scenes. I should be able to manage that without visions of impossible futures." The irony made her smile. Normal landscapes might actually be more challenging at this point. The tea Isabel prepared smelled of chamomile and hope, rather than herbs that opened doorways between worlds. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, planning practical details with the satisfaction of women who had faced impossible choices and found a path forward. "When will you leave?" Isabel asked. Mylene considered. "Soon. Today, maybe. I don't want to spend another night in Cedar Ridge." She paused, studying the older woman's face. "Come with me, at least until after the baby is born. You said yourself this cottage holds nothing for you now." Isabel's eyes brightened with something Mylene was learning to recognize, the look of a woman discovering she still had choices to make, futures to build instead of just preserving the past. "Yes," Isabel said simply. "I believe I will." Within an hour, they were moving with the efficiency of women who had learned not to second-guess their decisions. Isabel packed her few remaining belongings into a worn leather satchel, while Mylene returned to Cedar Ridge one final time, Brownie trotting beside her with renewed energy. The rental house felt like a monument to her former naivety. Marcus's coffee mug still sat in the sink where he'd left it 3 weeks ago, a ring of dried residue marking his last morning in their shared life. She stared at it for a moment, then deliberately left it unwashed. Some things deserved to be forgotten exactly as they were. Her art supplies filled 2 boxes. The canvases she'd started during the early hopeful months of her pregnancy, soft nursery scenes and gentle abstractions, went into a third. The painting of the impossible cabin she wrapped carefully in an old sheet. Whatever it represented now, it had been the beginning of her awakening. She wouldn't leave it behind. The landlord, Mrs. Henderson, accepted her early departure with obvious relief. "Probably for the best, dear," she said, not quite meeting Mylene's eyes. "Small towns can be difficult for women in your situation." "My situation," Mylene repeated flatly. "Unmarried mothers face challenges everywhere, but in Cedar Ridge." Mrs. Henderson trailed off with a meaningful look. Mylene felt something cold settle in her chest. Not hurt, but clarity. This was what she was leaving behind. Judgment disguised as concern, isolation dressed up as protection. Her daughter would never grow up in a place that treated a woman's courage to raise a child alone as something shameful. "You're right," she said, signing the lease termination with firm strokes. "This isn't the right place for us." By noon, she was loading her Honda Civic with everything that mattered. The back seat and trunk held boxes of art supplies, clothes, and the few pieces of furniture small enough to transport. Everything else, the rented couch where Marcus had promised her forever, the kitchen table where they'd planned their wedding, she left for the landlord to dispose of. Isabel emerged from her cottage carrying only the leather satchel and a small wooden box. "My grandmother's recipes," she explained when she saw Mylene looking. "The normal ones, beef stew and cornbread, remedies for teething babies and sleepless nights, the practical magic every mother needs." They secured Isabel's belongings in the remaining space, Brownie settling into the back seat with the contentment of a dog who understood that pack was more important than territory. As Mylene started the engine, she felt her daughter move, not the urgent, almost desperate activity of the past weeks, but gentle, settled motion, as if she, too, understood they were finally heading toward something instead of running away. The drive toward Oregon took them through mountain passes Mylene had never seen despite months of living in Montana. The landscape opened gradually from dense forest to rolling hills, each mile carrying them further from the weight of supernatural inheritance and closer to ordinary chosen possibilities. "Tell me about the house," Isabel said, as they wound through a particularly scenic stretch of highway. "I only visited once, when I was 12, Mylene said, adjusting her position to ease the pressure on her lower back. "My mother was having a difficult time, and my father thought reconnecting with family history might help. It didn't. She spent the whole week talking to people who weren't there and crying over things that hadn't happened yet. But I remember the house itself was beautiful. Old craftsman style, with a wraparound porch and fruit trees in the yard. And your grandmother, Emma? What was she like before the gift consumed her?" Mylene finished, strong, independent. She'd been a teacher before she married, which was unusual for women in her generation. "My mother said she used to tell the most wonderful stories, fairy tales with fierce heroines who saved themselves." Isabel smiled. "Those stories will matter more than any supernatural legacy. Children need to know that strength can be ordinary, that courage doesn't require mystical power." They stopped for lunch at a small diner in a town whose name Mylene didn't catch, eating simple food while planning practical details. Isabel had enough saved to help with initial repairs. Mylene could research midwives and set up prenatal care once they were settled. Together, they could restore the house room by room, creating the kind of home where a child could grow up surrounded by love instead of secrets. As they prepared to leave, Mylene felt a familiar tightening across her belly. Not a contraction, but her daughter's response to her elevated heart rate. The baby was listening to her emotional state, still connected despite the loss of their supernatural bond. "We're almost there," she murmured, one hand pressed to the spot where a tiny foot pushed against her ribs. "Almost home." The word felt strange and right at the same time. For the first time in months, she was moving towards something she had chosen, rather than fleeing from what had been chosen for her. The GPS led them down increasingly narrow roads as afternoons stretched toward evening, past farms where irrigation systems painted green arcs against brown fields and mailboxes marked properties that stretched beyond sight. When they finally turned onto Grandmother Emma's gravel drive, Mylene's breath caught in her throat. The house stood exactly as she remembered, yet somehow entirely different. The wraparound porch sagged in places, paint peeling from the cedar shakes, but the bones were strong. Apple trees heavy with late summer fruit created dappled shadows across overgrown grass, and evening primrose had colonized the flower beds in wild, cheerful abandonment. "It's perfect," Isabel breathed, and Mylene realized she was crying. Not the helpless tears that had marked so many moments over the past months, but something cleaner, relief maybe, or recognition. This place felt like sanctuary in a way that had nothing to do with supernatural protection and everything to do with the simple truth that some ground was meant to hold you. Brownie bounded from the car the moment she opened the door, racing in ecstatic circles around the yard before settling into serious investigation of new scents. His joy was infectious, practical, entirely focused on the present moment. "The key should be—" Mylene walked to the porch steps, memory guiding her to a loose board near the railing. Her fingers found the hidden compartment her grandmother had shown her 20 years ago, and, impossibly, the spare key was still there. The front door opened with the groan of wood swollen from years of winter rain, releasing the scent of dust and lavender, and something indefinably feminine. Late sunlight streamed through windows that hadn't been cleaned in decades, illuminating a living room frozen in time yet somehow still alive. Emma's furniture waited under white sheets like sleeping giants. Her books lined built-in shelves, spines faded but titles still readable. Poetry and philosophy mixed with practical volumes on gardening and child-rearing. A baby grand piano occupied one corner, its bench holding sheet music for lullabies written in Emma's careful script. She prepared this place, Mylene realized, lifting the sheet from a rocking chair positioned to catch morning light from the eastern windows. Not for herself, but for whoever came after. Isabel moved through the rooms with the reverence of someone entering a temple, her fingers trailing over surfaces that held decades of women's lives. "Look!" she called from the kitchen, her voice soft with wonder. Mylene found her standing before an old-fashioned pantry whose shelves held mason jars labeled in Emma's handwriting. Not magical preparations, but practical ones. Preserved fruits, pickled vegetables, dried herbs for cooking rather than casting. The kind of abundance that spoke to a woman's determination to nurture whoever might need feeding. She knew, Isabel said. Somehow, she knew someone would come home eventually. Upstairs, they discovered the nursery Emma had never used. The crib was antique but solid, its mattress long since claimed by mice, but the frame still sturdy. A trunk beneath the window held baby clothes from the 1940s, carefully wrapped in tissue that crumbled at their touch, but had preserved tiny gowns and blankets in shades of cream and pale yellow. Mylene lifted a christening dress from its tissue nest, fabric soft as prayer against her palms. As she held it, her daughter moved, not the frantic activity that had characterized the past weeks, but something that felt almost like contentment, recognition perhaps of a place where she belonged without condition or supernatural burden. That was when it hit her. Not a vision this time, but simple human understanding. This was the test. Not the supernatural collectors or the inherited gift or even Marcus's abandonment. This moment, standing in the nursery her grandmother had prepared for grandchildren she'd never held, holding clothes for great-grandchildren she'd never meet. The test was whether she could choose love without guarantee, whether she could commit to building something beautiful without knowing if it would last, whether she could mother her daughter with ordinary courage instead of mystical protection. "The gift isn't gone," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just changed, from seeing impossible futures to creating possible ones." Isabel appeared in the nursery doorway, her face gentle with understanding. Every generation faces the same choice, supernatural or not. We can pass on our fears or our hopes, our wounds or our wisdom. Mylene pressed the christening dress to her chest and felt her daughter respond with a flutter of movement that spoke nothing of destiny or inherited power. Just a baby recognizing her mother's heartbeat, trusting in the love that surrounded her. "She'll grow up here," Mylene said, and it wasn't prediction but promise. With stories about strong women who chose hope over fear, with roots in ground that holds 3 generations of determination to build something beautiful. She paused, one hand resting on her belly. And if anything supernatural ever comes for her, she'll face it the way her grandmother and great-grandmother and great-great-grandmother did. Not alone. Outside, evening was settling over the orchard, painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. But as darkness deepened beyond the nursery windows, the golden light began to shift and twist. Mylene felt her daughter's contented movements suddenly still, that terrible familiar stillness that had preceded every supernatural encounter. The christening dress in her hands grew cold, and the temperature in the room plummeted despite the summer heat. "No," she whispered, backing toward Isabel. "Not here. Not now. We destroyed it all." The air shimmered, and she was no longer in Emma's nursery but standing in that impossible clearing deep in the Bitterroot wilderness. The weathered cabin materialized before them, smoke curling from its chimney in defiance of natural law. But this time, the door stood wide open, and the woman who emerged was not the older version of herself she'd encountered before. It was Emma, her great-grandmother, exactly as she appeared in the faded photographs, but with eyes that held decades of accumulated sorrow and supernatural burden. Behind her came the others, generations of Carter women, each bearing the weight of the gift that had defined and destroyed their lives. "You thought you could simply walk away," Emma said, her voice carrying the authority of the ancestral line. "You thought burning Isabel's cottage would sever what runs deeper than ritual, older than protection spells." Mylene's mother stepped from the cabin's shadows, looking exactly as she had in those final, terrible months before her death. "The gift doesn't die, Mylene, it just waits. And your daughter?" Her gaze fixed on Mylene's swollen belly with hungry intensity. "She'll be stronger than any of us, the bloodline concentrated, purified through your suffering." "She's right," came another voice, and Marcus emerged from behind the cabin. But his face was wrong, twisted with an intelligence that wasn't entirely his own. "Did you really think I left because I couldn't handle your pregnancy? I was sent to isolate you, to ensure the child would be born without ties to the mundane world." Terror flooded Mylene's system, but beneath it rose something fiercer, the protective rage of a mother facing threat to her unborn child. "You're lying. All of this is just fear made manifest, trauma trying to drag me back into old patterns." Emma smiled, and the expression was terrible in its certainty. "Touch your belly, child. Feel how still she's become. She recognizes her true family now." Against her will, Mylene's hand moved to her abdomen. Her daughter wasn't moving at all, not even the tiny flutters that had become constant companions. Panic clawed at her throat. "What have you done to her?" "Nothing yet," her mother said gently. "But she must choose. The ordinary life you're planning will kill her gift before it fully manifests. Here with us, she can become what she was meant to be, what we all were meant to be, before fear made us small." The cabin door widened, revealing an interior that defied the structure's modest exterior. Inside, Mylene glimpsed rooms stretching impossibly deep, filled with other women, Carter women from generations she'd never known existed, each radiating power that made Isabel's abilities seem like parlor tricks. "This is the true inheritance," Emma continued. "Not the burden you've imagined, but apotheosis. Your daughter will never know abandonment, never suffer the isolation that marked our lives. She'll be surrounded by family who understand her gifts, who can teach her to wield power that reshapes reality itself." Isabel stepped forward, her weathered face set with determination. "And she'll never know ordinary love, ordinary joy, ordinary choice. You're offering her a beautiful prison." "Silence." Marcus's voice carried inhuman resonance now. "You've already lost your power, old woman. You have no standing in this matter." But as he spoke, Brownie emerged from the woods behind them, moving with purpose that seemed almost supernatural itself. The dog positioned himself between Mylene and the cabin, hackles raised, emitting a low growl that spoke of absolute loyalty and very ordinary, very real protection. The sight of him, solid, warm, utterly present, gave Mylene the anchor she needed. This was the choice Emma had spoken of, the test that defined each generation. Not whether to accept supernatural power, but whether to choose love over control, connection over dominion. "I know what you are," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You're every woman's fear that she's not enough without some special gift to make her valuable. You're the voice that says ordinary love isn't worth the risk, that safety lies in isolation and power rather than community and vulnerability." The assembled figures flickered like candle flames in wind. "My daughter will grow up knowing she's loved for who she is, not what she can do," Mylene continued. "She'll have ordinary friends and ordinary struggles and ordinary triumphs. And if she inherits any gift at all, it will be the knowledge that she's never alone, that strength comes from connection, not from standing apart." Emma's expression shifted, uncertainty replacing absolute conviction. "You would condemn her to ordinariness? To the pain we tried so hard to spare you?" "I would give her the choice we never had," Mylene said firmly, "to be extraordinary in ordinary ways." The clearing began to dissolve, taking the impossible cabin and its ghostly inhabitants with it. But Mylene felt something else dissolving too. The last threads of supernatural connection that had bound her to inherited trauma disguised as inherited gift. In her belly, her daughter began to move again. As the clearing dissolved around them, Mylene felt the familiar sensation of reality reassembling itself. But something was wrong. The dissolution wasn't complete. Threads of supernatural energy clung to her like spider webs, and she realized with growing horror that breaking free would require more than simple rejection. "You cannot escape without payment," Emma's voice echoed from the fading vision, no longer gentle but implacable as stone. "The gift demands balance. To sever the line completely, something of equal value must be offered in exchange." The nursery materialized around them again, but it felt different now, charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. Isabel gripped Mylene's arm, her weathered face pale with understanding. "What does that mean?" Mylene demanded, though part of her already knew. The supernatural world operated on ancient laws of exchange, of balance maintained through sacrifice. "The sight," Isabel whispered. "Your ability to perceive beyond the veil. It's been growing stronger throughout your pregnancy. To cut the line permanently, to ensure your daughter is truly free, you'll have to give up any trace of inherited ability. Forever." Mylene's hand pressed to her belly, where her daughter moved with renewed vigor, as if sensing the moment of decision. The baby's kicks felt urgent, communicative in the way that had marked their supernatural connection from the beginning. Through that touch, Mylene suddenly understood everything, not through mystical vision, but through the clarity that comes in moments of absolute crisis. She could see the paths stretching before them. Keep even the smallest thread of ability, and her daughter would inherit not just the gift, but the endless cycle of isolation and supernatural burden. Every generation would face this same terrible choice, this same promise of power wrapped around a core of inherited trauma. But to sever it completely would mean losing the one thing that had guided her through these terrifying months. The intuitive connection to her unborn child, the ability to sense danger before it struck, the supernatural awareness that had ultimately led her to Isabel, to safety, to this moment of choice itself. "There's more," Isabel continued, her voice heavy with sorrow. "The severance. It won't just take your supernatural sight, it will take all enhanced perception. You'll lose the artist's eye that sees beauty in shadow and light, the intuitive understanding of color and form that makes your paintings more than mere representation." The words hit like a physical blow. Mylene's art hadn't just been her profession, it had been her identity, her way of processing the world, her means of creating beauty from pain. The thought of losing that gift, of seeing the world through purely ordinary eyes, felt like death of the essential self. "I can't," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's everything I am. Without it, I'm just a mother who loves her child enough to ensure she's free," Isabel finished gently. "Just a woman brave enough to build a life on love instead of ability. Just human." From outside came the sound of wind in the apple trees, ordinary and eternal. Brownie's soft panting as he settled on the nursery floor, his simple presence a reminder that loyalty and love required no supernatural enhancement. The distant hum of crickets beginning their evening chorus, marking time in the most natural way. Mylene closed her eyes and let herself truly feel what losing her artistic vision would mean. No more seeing the precise moment when afternoon light transformed mundane objects into poetry. No more intuitive understanding of how color could convey emotion that words couldn't touch. No more paintings that seemed to capture something beyond their physical subjects. But as she grieved that loss, she became aware of something else. Her daughter's movements against her palm weren't desperate or supernatural now. They were simply the movements of a healthy baby eager to be born into a world where she could become anything she chose to be. "She'll never know the isolation we've carried," Mylene said, understanding flooding through her. "She'll never feel set apart by abilities that make ordinary relationships impossible. She'll grow up believing she belongs in the world, not above it." Isabel nodded, tears bright in her own eyes. And you'll learn to see beauty through her eyes instead of supernatural ones. You'll discover that love is the most extraordinary, ordinary thing of all. Mylene felt the choice crystallize, terrible and clear. She thought of all the Carter women who had chosen power over connection, supernatural sight over simple human love, who had traded the messiness and vulnerability of ordinary life for the cold comfort of mystical isolation. "I choose her freedom," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I choose ordinary. I choose human." The words acted like a key turning in an ancient lock. Power flowed out of her, not violently, but like water finding its natural level. She felt her supernatural sight dim and fade, taking with it the artist's enhanced perception that had defined her for 28 years. But as the gift dissolved, something else flowered in its place, the fierce, protective love of a mother willing to sacrifice everything for her child's chance at genuine choice. In her belly, her daughter settled into peaceful movement, finally, completely free. The silence that followed felt profound, like the hush after a storm when the world holds its breath before beginning again. Mylene stood in the nursery, one hand still pressed to her belly, feeling the absence of power like phantom pain from an amputated limb. The supernatural sight that had colored every moment of her existence for 28 years was simply gone, leaving behind vision that was startlingly, bewilderingly normal. She looked around the nursery and saw it differently now, not through the enhanced perception that had revealed layers of meaning in every shadow and curve, but through purely human eyes. The walls were just walls, painted in faded yellow that needed refreshing. The antique crib was beautiful not because of some mystical resonance, but because careful hands had sanded and assembled it with love decades ago. Ordinary light fell through ordinary windows, and it was enough. "How do you feel?" Isabel asked softly, watching her with concerned eyes. "Empty," Mylene admitted, then paused, considering. "No, not empty. Different. Like I've been holding my breath my entire life and can finally exhale." She moved to the window, looking out at the apple orchard where evening shadows stretched long and natural. "I can't see the patterns anymore. The connections between past and future, the way supernatural energy moved through everything. It's just trees and grass and sky." Isabel joined her at the window, her weathered hands clasped before her. "Do you regret it?" Mylene was quiet for a long moment, honestly examining her heart. The loss of her artistic vision felt raw, a grief she would carry for years to come. She might never again create paintings that seemed to capture souls rather than faces, never again see the precise moment when ordinary light became transcendent. But beneath that loss, something else was growing. "Ask me again when she's born," she said finally. "When I'm teaching her to ride a bike, or helping with homework, or dealing with teenage dramatics. When she's living the ordinary life I just bought for her." Her daughter chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, and Mylene laughed. The first genuinely joyful sound she'd made in months. "I think she approves." "The connection between you hasn't disappeared entirely," Isabel observed. "It's just become natural, the way any mother learns to interpret her child's needs." They were interrupted by Brownie's soft whine from downstairs. Through the window, Mylene could see headlights winding up the mountain road, the first vehicle to approach the cabin since they'd arrived. Her heart clenched with familiar fear before she remembered there was nothing supernatural left to threaten them, just ordinary concerns requiring ordinary caution. "I'll check," Isabel said. But Mylene was already moving toward the stairs, surprising herself with how naturally she'd claimed protector role without supernatural early warning systems. The vehicle turned out to be Tom's familiar pickup truck, and the relief that flooded through her was purely human, no mystical confirmation required. She watched through Emma's front windows as he climbed out, moving with the careful consideration of someone who'd been genuinely worried about their safety during the long afternoon they'd been gone. "Everything all right?" he called as Isabel opened the front door. "When you didn't come back by sunset, I figured I better check. These mountains can be tricky for folks who don't know them." "We're fine," Mylene answered, stepping into view. "Better than fine, actually." She gestured around the cabin's interior, where dust motes danced in lamplight, and everything spoke of ordinary human habitation rather than supernatural preservation. "We're home." Tom's weathered face creased into a smile. Emma would be pleased. She always said this place was meant for family, not for standing empty. He paused, studying Mylene's face with the perception of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize significant change. "You look different. More settled somehow." "I feel different," she admitted. "Like I finally know who I'm supposed to be." As they talked, making plans for bringing her things from town, for contacting doctors and preparing for the baby's arrival, Mylene marveled at how natural it all felt. No supernatural complications, no mystical threats requiring magical solutions, just practical concerns handled by ordinary people choosing to help one another. Later, after Tom had gone and Isabel had settled into Emma's old bedroom, Mylene sat in the rocking chair by the nursery window. Without enhanced perception, the night outside looked different, not layered with hidden meanings, but simply beautiful in the way summer evenings had always been beautiful. Crickets sang their ancient songs, apple trees rustled in gentle wind. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. Her daughter moved sleepily now, the urgent communication of recent weeks replaced by the drowsy contentment of a baby ready to be born into safety. Mylene rested her hands on her belly and felt the future stretching ahead, uncertain, challenging, but entirely free of inherited destiny. Tomorrow, she would start learning to live as purely human. Tonight, she would simply rock in her great-grandmother's chair and listen to ordinary night sounds, grateful beyond measure for the gift of choosing ordinary love. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that Mylene was learning to call normal. She woke each morning not to supernatural premonitions, but to the simple needs of her increasingly restless body and the gentle sounds of Isabel preparing breakfast downstairs. The loss of her enhanced perception had left her feeling unmoored at first, like a sailor suddenly navigating by stars she couldn't read, but gradually she was discovering the unexpected peace of living purely in the present moment. The cabin had transformed around them through purely human effort. Tom had helped them bring her easel and art supplies from town, though the canvases she'd completed months ago now looked foreign to her, painted by someone whose eyes had seen layers of reality she could no longer access. She'd tried painting again, hoping ordinary sight might reveal its own kind of beauty, but her hands seemed to have forgotten their purpose without supernatural guidance. The brushes felt clumsy, the colors flat and unresponsive. "It will come back differently," Isabel had assured her during one of their evening conversations on the front porch. "Not the gift you had before, but something new. Something chosen rather than inherited." This morning, Mylene found herself standing in the nursery doorway, studying the way early sunlight fell across the freshly assembled crib. Tom had brought the mattress yesterday, along with sheets Isabel had found at the local store, simple white cotton dotted with tiny yellow ducks. Nothing mystical or meaningful, just the kind of bedding millions of babies slept on safely every night. Her daughter responded to the morning light with a series of gentle movements that felt like stretching. 8 months pregnant now, with delivery growing close enough to make plans feel urgent rather than theoretical. Dr. Patterson would drive up from town next week to check on her progress, an arrangement that still amazed Mylene with its simple practicality. No supernatural midwives or mystical preparations, just modern medicine making house calls because a pregnant woman had chosen to live somewhere beautiful and remote. "Mylene," Isabel's voice carried up from the kitchen. "Tom's here." She found them at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and the blueberry muffins Isabel had been perfecting in Emma's old recipe collection. Tom looked up as she entered, his expression carrying a mixture of excitement and careful restraint that made her suddenly alert. "What is it?" she asked, settling into the third chair with the careful movements of someone whose center of gravity had shifted dramatically. "Got a call from Cedar Ridge General this morning," he said. "Figured you'd want to know. Marcus showed up at the emergency room last night, dehydrated, disoriented, claiming he'd been lost in the woods for weeks with no memory of how he got there." The name hit her like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting this moment since the supernatural confrontation had dissolved. Marcus, the real Marcus, stripped of whatever influence had been guiding him during those final terrible encounters. The man who had left her pregnant and alone, but who might not have been entirely himself when he'd done it. "Is he all right?" she asked, surprised to discover she genuinely wanted to know. "Physically, yes. Mentally." Tom shrugged. "Doctors say he keeps asking about you. Says he remembers leaving town but nothing after that until he woke up 3 days ago by the highway. Claims he needs to find you, to explain something he can't quite remember." Myleen's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where her daughter had gone very still, as if sensing her mother's emotional turbulence. Without supernatural insight, she couldn't know what Marcus's return meant, couldn't read the patterns or predict the consequences. She was reduced to purely human decision-making, weighing practical considerations against emotional needs. "He wants to see me," she said. It wasn't a question. "Ask Tom to pass along the message if he saw you," Isabel confirmed gently. "No pressure, no demands, just a request." The old Myleen, armed with supernatural sight, might have seen this moment coming from weeks away. She might have prepared speeches or strategies, might have consulted mystical signs for guidance on how to respond. This new version of herself had to rely on something much simpler and infinitely more complex: her own human heart. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "This life we're building here, it's the first time I've felt safe in months. I don't want to risk that lightly." Tom nodded, understanding written in the lines around his eyes. "No rush. He's not going anywhere for a few days anyway. Doctors want to keep him for observation. But Myleen?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes facing the past is the only way to be truly free of it. After he left, Myleen found herself drawn back to the nursery, to the rocking chair that had become her thinking place. Outside, the apple trees were heavy with fruit that would ripen in ordinary time, following natural seasons rather than supernatural schedules. Her daughter moved sleepily against her ribs, trusting and content. For the first time in her life, Myleen had to choose her future using nothing more than human wisdom and ordinary love. It was terrifying. It was exactly what she'd hoped for. The decision came to her 2 days later, not through supernatural insight but through the simple human process of weighing love against fear. She would see Marcus, but on her terms, in the place that had become her sanctuary. If there were explanations to be made or forgiveness to be offered, they would happen in the shadow of the life she'd chosen, rather than the wreckage of what they'd lost. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when the late August heat shimmered off the mountain roads and the apple trees hung heavy with fruit ready for harvest. Myleen watched from the nursery window as Tom's truck wound up the familiar path, knowing without supernatural confirmation that this conversation would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of something entirely new. Marcus looked smaller than she remembered, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with his 3-day ordeal in the woods. The confident swagger that had once attracted her was gone, replaced by the careful movements of someone who no longer trusted his own judgment. When he climbed out of the truck, his eyes went immediately to the cabin windows, searching for her face with an expression of desperate hope that made her heart ache in ways she'd thought were safely buried. Isabel met him at the front door, her weathered hands gentle but firm as she explained the ground rules. This was Myleen's home now, her place of safety. He was welcome to visit, to say whatever needed saying, but he would leave when asked and return only if invited. The supernatural influences that had tangled their relationship were gone, leaving only human choices and human consequences. Myleen found him standing in the living room, staring at Emma's family photographs with the bewildered expression of someone trying to piece together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. When he turned to face her, his eyes went immediately to her belly, to the undeniable evidence of how much time had passed and how much had changed. "Jesus, Myleen," he whispered, and she heard genuine anguish in his voice. "What did I do to you?" "You left," she said simply, settling into the chair Isabel had positioned near the fireplace. Her daughter responded to the emotional tension with restless movements, and Myleen rested her hands protectively over the space where new life grew. "You packed a bag one morning and drove away without explanation. That's what you did." Marcus sank into the opposite chair, his face pale with what looked like genuine confusion. I remember packing. I remember feeling like I had to leave, like staying would destroy us both. But I can't remember why I felt that way. It's like someone else was making the decision and I was just watching. The old Mylene might have explained about supernatural influences and inherited destinies, might have helped him understand how forces beyond their control had manipulated their relationship. This version simply listened, letting him work through his fragmented memories without supernatural assistance. "I found you," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each recovered fragment. "Weeks later, I think, in town at that art supply store, but when I tried to talk to you, you looked at me like I was a stranger, like I was dangerous." He paused, studying her face. Was I dangerous? Mylene considered the question carefully, weighing honesty against kindness. "You weren't yourself," she said finally. "Neither of us were, really. We were caught up in something bigger than we understood, something that made healthy choices impossible. And now? Now I'm free," she said, and felt the truth of it settle around her like a comfortable shawl. "We both are. Whatever was influencing us, whatever patterns we were trapped in, they're broken now." Marcus was quiet for a long time, studying her face with the desperate intensity of someone trying to memorize something precious they were about to lose. "You look different," he said finally. "Peaceful. Like you found something I didn't know you were looking for." "I found myself," Mylene replied. "The person I was meant to be all along, underneath everything else." They talked through the afternoon, carefully exploring the edges of their shared trauma like survivors of a disaster comparing scars. Marcus remembered fragments, the compulsive need to leave, the weeks of wandering with no clear destination, the growing certainty that returning to her would somehow bring catastrophe. But the supernatural elements that had driven those feelings were gone, leaving only the human aftermath of choices made under impossible circumstances. As evening approached and the light through the windows turned golden, Marcus finally asked the question she'd been expecting. "The baby, is it?" "Yours," she confirmed, "and mine. And entirely her own person, free to become whoever she chooses to be." He nodded, tears bright in his eyes. "What do you need from me? Money, support, involvement? I know I have no right to ask for anything, but if there's a way to make amends—" Mylene felt her daughter's responding movement and smiled at the simple miracle of it. A conversation about practical concerns between two people who genuinely wanted to do right by each other. No supernatural complications, no mystical destinies. Just human beings choosing kindness. "Right now, I need time," she said, "to finish becoming who I'm supposed to be, to prepare for her arrival. But Marcus? I think there might be room in her life for a father who's learned the difference between running away and giving space." When Tom's truck carried Marcus back down the mountain, Mylene remained on the front porch, watching darkness settle over the valley. Isabel joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea and the comfortable silence of shared understanding. "How do you feel?" Isabel asked. "Grateful," Mylene said, surprising herself with the certainty of it. "For the first time in my life, the future feels like something I get to write, rather than something I have to survive." Her daughter moved gently against her ribs, and Mylene smiled at the simple perfection of it. New life growing toward a world full of ordinary possibilities, infinite and free. Tomorrow she would start painting again, learning to see beauty through purely human eyes. Tonight, she would simply sit with the woman who had helped her choose freedom, listening to the eternal song of crickets and feeling grateful for the magnificent burden of ordinary love. The story was ending, but the life, their real life, chosen rather than inherited, was just beginning.